The blood-red horizon of Vulcarus stretched endlessly before Noah Briggs as he stepped off the transport vessel. Volcanic gases swirled in the distance, illuminated by the perpetual glow of active lava flows. The air smelled of sulfur and metal, an acrid combination that made his nostrils flare despite the environmental filters of his suit. Around him, 37 other cadets from across the galaxy disembarked, their expressions a mixture of awe and apprehension beneath their protective visors. "Welcome to Hell Week, cadets," announced a crystalline voice from ahead. Noah squinted through the haze. Professor Grethen stood before them, her translucent, silicate body reflecting the reddish light in prismatic patterns. As a native crystalline from the silicon-based planet Quartz Prime, she appeared perfectly at home in this hostile environment. "This is Vulcarus," she continued, gesturing at the desolate landscape with a crystalline arm. "One of the most geologically unstable planets in the Orion Quadrant, and your survival training ground for the next 7 days. The Galactic Exploration Academy does not graduate theorists. We graduate survivors." Noah straightened his posture as the professor's gaze swept over the assembled cadets. He'd worked too hard to earn his place at the academy to show any weakness now. As the only human in this year's cohort, he already stood out, his stocky frame and dusky complexion marking him clearly among the diverse array of species. "Cadets, prepare for equipment inspection," Professor Grethen announced, her voice cutting through the distant rumble of geological activity. Noah watched as his classmates eagerly produced their advanced tools. Cadet Varex, a blue-skinned Andromedian, displayed a plasma cutter that hummed with energy. The Tripital Thornock from the gas giants of Titan 7 revealed a molecular resonance drill that could disintegrate rock through vibration alone. Sarah, one of the few humanoids besides Noah, though from the Pleiadian system, showcased a swarm of nanodrones designed to cool and reconstruct geological materials. When Professor Grethen reached Noah, he pulled out his equipment with practiced confidence, a simple 15-centimeter blade of folded steel with a worn wooden handle. It had been in his family for generations, passed down from his great-grandfather, who had been an explorer on Earth long before humans joined the Galactic Alliance. The crystalline professor froze, her silicon-based eyes widening in what Noah recognized as disbelief. "What?" she said slowly. "Is that primitive implement?" Noah held the knife steadily. "Earth-made steel blade, Professor. Carbon content precisely balanced for both flexibility and hardness. My great-grandfather—" A sound like shattering glass interrupted him. It took Noah a moment to realize Professor Grethen was laughing. "A knife!" she exclaimed, her voice rising so that the entire class could hear. "A simple metal knife. This is the Galactic Exploration Academy, not a historical reenactment society." Laughter rippled through the assembled cadets. Noah's jaw tightened, but he kept his expression neutral. "Tell me, Cadet Briggs," Professor Grethen continued, her crystalline form still vibrating with amusement. "Do you also carry flint to make fire? Perhaps a bow and arrow for hunting?" More laughter. Noah took a deep breath. "No, Professor, just the knife." "How quaint," she replied, moving on to the next cadet. "Let's hope your primitive sentimentality doesn't get you killed." Noah slipped the knife back into its sheath at his belt. He'd expected skepticism, but not outright mockery. Still, he knew what the blade could do in the right hands. His great-grandfather had survived 3 years alone in the Antarctic, with nothing but that knife in his wits. Noah had trained with it since childhood, learning its balance, its strengths, and its limits. After completing the inspection, Professor Grethen ascended a small outcropping of obsidian rock. The black, glass-like stone glinted dangerously in the red light. "Your first survival test begins now," she announced. "Vulcarus experiences seismic cycles approximately every 15 hours. Between cycles, you will have precisely 5 intervals to carve shelter into the obsidian cliffs before you." Noah surveyed the imposing wall of black volcanic glass that towered above them. Obsidian, one of the hardest naturally occurring substances in the galaxy, yet also one of the most brittle. Each of you will create a shelter capable of withstanding both the seismic activity and the plasma storms that follow. Professor Grethen continued. You will use only your personal equipment. No sharing. No collaboration. She tapped her crystalline arm, and a holographic display appeared above it. The storms typically reach Category 3, but sensors indicate a potential for Category 5 this cycle. Your shelters must accommodate this possibility. Noah felt a knot form in his stomach. Category 5 plasma storms could melt standard starship hulls. Any questions? Professor Grethen asked, her tone suggesting she expected none. Cadet Varex raised a tentacle. Professor, what are the minimum dimensions for the shelter? 2 by 2 by 3 meters, she replied promptly. Sufficient for your physical form plus essential survival gear. Noah quickly calculated in his head. That was a lot of obsidian to remove with just a knife. Around him, the other cadets were already activating their tools, confident in their technological advantages. Begin now, Professor Grethen announced. Your time starts immediately. The air filled with the whir of machinery and the hiss of plasma cutters. Noah alone stood motionless, studying the obsidian cliff face, where others saw only an obstacle to be brute-forced. He saw patterns, faint lines of stress, minute differences in coloration that indicated varying density. Thin layers of volcanic ash trapped between sheets of the glass-like rock. While his classmates immediately began carving into the smooth sections of obsidian, Noah walked along the base of the cliff, tapping occasionally with the handle of his knife, listening to the subtle changes in resonance. After nearly 20 minutes of observation, precious time that made the other cadets exchange glances and snicker, he finally selected his spot. It wasn't the most aesthetically pleasing section. In fact, it was marred by what appeared to be imperfections, a series of hairline fractures and a dusty overlay of uncrystallized ash. But to Noah's trained eye, these weren't flaws. They were opportunities. He unsheathed his knife and began to work. First, he scraped away the ash layer, revealing the network of natural fractures beneath. Then, with careful precision, he inserted the tip of his blade into the widest crack and applied gentle pressure, not to break the obsidian, but to understand how it wanted to break. The obsidian responded with a small, controlled split that followed the natural stress line. Noah smiled. The rock was speaking to him. While the mechanical whine of his classmates' tools filled the air, Noah worked in near silence, his blade finding the paths of least resistance in the volcanic glass. He wasn't cutting so much as guiding, letting the obsidian's own structure determine where it would separate. An hour passed. Noah had managed to deepen the initial crack to about half a meter, a modest beginning compared to the cave-like openings his classmates were already creating with their advanced tools. But he remained patient, methodical. Then came the first signs of trouble for the others. "Plasma cutter's overheating!" came a shout from Varex. The Andromedian's tool was emitting an alarming series of beeps as its cooling system struggled against the ambient heat of Vulcarus. Similar issues began to plague the other cadets. The planetary conditions, high ambient temperature, corrosive atmospheric elements, and constant microseismic vibrations were taking their toll on the sophisticated equipment. Tools designed for controlled environments were failing in Vulcarus's hostile reality. Noah continued his work, unaffected. His knife required no power source, no cooling system, no calibration. It was simply steel against stone, guided by understanding and patience. By the end of the second hour, Noah had established the basic outline of his shelter entrance, a narrow, diagonal slash that would eventually widen into his living space. The entrance was deliberately small, both to minimize structural weakening and to reduce exposure to the coming storm. Meanwhile, the more technologically equipped cadets had created impressive caverns, but were now facing unexpected challenges. The obsidian, when cut with high-energy tools, was developing microfractures that spread unpredictably. Several shelters that had initially seemed sturdy were now showing signs of instability. "How's that ancient letter opener working out for you, Earther?" called Thornick, the tripedal cadet, as he paused to let his resonance drill cool down. Noah didn't respond immediately. He was focused on creating a series of chevron-shaped grooves in the ceiling of his growing shelter, a technique his great-grandfather had used to prevent cave-ins in unstable ice shelves. The obsidian responded differently than ice, of course, but the principle remained sound, distributing pressure along natural lines of force. "It's working exactly as intended," Noah finally replied, not looking up from his task. "No overheating, no power consumption, no recalibration needed." Thornock made a dismissive sound and returned to his drilling, but not before Noah noticed the concerned look he cast at his instrument's diagnostic display. By the end of the third hour, Noah had hollowed out approximately one-third of his required space. His progress was slower than the others, but while they fought against the obsidian, he worked with it. Every cut was deliberate, every removed section carefully considered for its structural implications. He was creating ventilation channels now, narrow slits that would allow air circulation without compromising the shelter's integrity during the storm. The channels followed the natural veins in the obsidian, places where the rock was minutely less dense. A sudden tremor shook the ground. Not the full seismic cycle, but a precursor. Several cadets shouted in alarm as cracks appeared in their shelter walls. Two structures partially collapsed, sending clouds of obsidian dust into the air. Noah's shelter, though smaller, remained intact. The chevron patterns he'd carved into the ceiling had distributed the seismic force precisely as he'd intended. Professor Grethen appeared, moving efficiently from shelter to shelter, assessing the damage. When she reached Noah's site, her crystalline features arranged themselves into what he recognized as surprise. "Interesting approach, Cadet Briggs," she said, studying the geometric patterns he'd created. "Though I question whether you'll complete the minimum dimensions in time." Noah wiped sweat from his brow. "I'll be ready, Professor." She made a non-committal sound and moved on. But Noah noticed she'd spent more time studying his work than she had the others. The fourth hour brought increased difficulties for everyone. The microseismic activity was intensifying as the main cycle approached. Tools that had been merely malfunctioning were now failing completely. Varex's plasma cutter shut down entirely, its circuits fried by a power surge. Sarah's nanodrones began to malfunction, their delicate programming confused by the magnetic fluctuations that preceded plasma storms. Noah continued his methodical work, though not without challenges. The obsidian was becoming more unstable as the seismic pressure built. Twice he had to abandon promising sections when he detected the telltale signs of imminent fracturing. But his knife remained reliable, and his growing understanding of this particular rock formation guided his hand. He was now creating a series of obsidian braces, carefully shaped columns that would support the ceiling during the worst of the storm. Unlike his classmates' smooth-walled shelters, Noah's space was taking on an organic appearance, with intentional irregularities that actually strengthened the structure. "Atmospheric sensors indicate the plasma storm has accelerated," Professor Grethen announced suddenly. "Estimated arrival in 1 hour, not 2 as previously calculated." A collective groan rose from the cadets. Equipment failures had already put many of them behind schedule. Now, they had even less time. Noah felt a surge of adrenaline. His shelter was functional, but not complete. He still needed to create the windbreak that would deflect the worst of the plasma winds from his entrance. Working with increased urgency, but refusing to sacrifice precision, Noah began to shape a series of obsidian shards into an overlapping shield. Each piece had to be the right size and thickness. Too thin, and the plasma would melt it. Too thick, and it might shatter during seismic activity. The sky above was darkening, not with normal clouds, but with electromagnetic disturbances that preceded a plasma storm. Flickers of energy, like silent lightning, were already visible on the horizon. 30 minutes to projected storm front, Professor Grethen called out. Around Noah, panic was setting in. Several cadets had abandoned their failing technology and were attempting to manually shore up their shelters. Others were frantically trying to repair their tools. The air was filled with curses in a dozen different languages from across the galaxy. Noah focused entirely on his task. The windbreak was taking shape, a semicircular arrangement of obsidian plates, each angled to deflect the plasma winds upward. Behind this, he had created a series of baffles at his shelter's entrance that would prevent direct gusts from entering, while still allowing breathable air to circulate. Inside, his shelter was smaller than the others, just meeting the minimum requirements. But what it lacked in space, it made up for in thoughtful design. The ceiling was braced with the chevron supports. The walls were lined with natural ridges that he'd enhanced to channel any cracks along predetermined paths that wouldn't compromise the overall structure. Near the back, he'd even managed to create a small sleeping platform elevated above the floor, where seismic vibrations would be minimized. A particularly violent tremor shook the ground. From further down the cliff face came the sound of catastrophic failure as one of the larger shelters collapsed entirely. Its creator, a multi-limbed Octavian, barely escaped being crushed. 15 minutes! Professor Grethen shouted above the growing wind. The first tendrils of the plasma storm were reaching them now, glowing filaments of charged particles that snaked across the ground like living things. Noah made his final adjustments. The windbreak was complete. The ventilation system was functional. The structural supports were in place. He stepped back to assess his work, just as the sky erupted in a display of electromagnetic fury. The plasma storm had arrived. All cadets, into your shelters now, Professor Grethen commanded, her crystalline form already retreating to the reinforced observation post some distance away. Noah ducked into his shelter, pulling the final piece of his defense into place, a slab of obsidian he'd shaped to serve as a door. It fit into the entrance with only millimeters to spare, its edges resting in grooves he'd carved specifically for this purpose. A small opening at the bottom allowed for minimal air exchange, while keeping out the worst of the storm. Through this opening, Noah watched as plasma winds began to howl across the landscape. The charged particles illuminated everything in an eerie blue-green glow, turning Volcarus into an alien dreamscape. The ground trembled continuously now as the seismic cycle reached its peak. From his position, Noah could see several other shelters beginning to fail. The perfect, machine-cut caves with their straight walls and smooth ceilings were developing cracks as the obsidian responded to the seismic stresses. Without the deliberate irregularities and stress-distributing patterns that Noah had incorporated, they were proving dangerously fragile. A particularly violent plasma gust slammed into the cliff face. Noah's windbreak glowed white-hot but held, the overlapping plates distributing the heat rather than allowing it to concentrate in any one area. Inside, the temperature rose uncomfortably but remained survivable. Not everyone was so fortunate. A scream cut through the storm's roar as one shelter's entrance collapsed, trapping its occupant inside. Another cadet was frantically trying to shield himself from plasma winds after his door mechanism failed. Noah watched in horror as the storm intensified beyond even the Category 5 predictions. This was something worse, a plasma superstorm that perhaps occurred once a century. The winds were now carrying actual globules of plasma that splattered against the rock like liquid lightning, leaving smoking craters wherever they hit. His shelter creaked and groaned around him. The obsidian was heating unevenly, creating new stresses that his design hadn't fully anticipated. A thin crack appeared in the ceiling despite the chevron supports. Noah unsheathed his knife again. Working quickly but methodically, he carved a series of small, pressure-release channels around the crack, giving the expanding obsidian somewhere to direct its stress. The crack stabilized, spreading no further. Outside, the situation was deteriorating rapidly. Most of the high-tech shelters were failing catastrophically, unable to adapt to the unprecedented conditions. Cadets were abandoning them, making desperate runs toward the distant emergency bunkers that Professor Grethen had mentioned during orientation, but had hoped would not be necessary. A pounding at Noah's door startled him. He peered through the ventilation gap to see Sarah, the Pleiadian cadet, her face contorted in panic. "Let me in!" she shouted above the storm. "My shelter collapsed!" Without hesitation, Noah shifted his obsidian door aside, allowing her to scramble in before quickly replacing it. Sarah collapsed on the floor, breathing heavily, her environmental suit scorched in several places by plasma contact. "Thank you," she gasped. I didn't think you'd even have room in this tiny cave." Noah didn't take offense. "The design prioritized stability over space," he explained, helping her move further from the entrance. "Are you injured?" She shook her head. "Just scared. My drones all failed at once. The ceiling came down seconds later." Another pounding at the door. This time it was Thornick, one of his 3 legs visibly injured. "Earther, help!" Again. Noah admitted the desperate cadet, quickly securing the door afterward. His shelter, designed for one, was becoming cramped with 3 occupants. But it continued to hold against the dual onslaught of seismic activity and plasma winds. "Your primitive hole in the rock is the only one still intact on this section of the cliff," Thornock admitted, his species equivalent of embarrassment evident in the drooping of his eye stalks. "The resonance drill created microfractures I couldn't detect until it was too late." Noah nodded, understanding. "High-energy tools often create invisible stress patterns in obsidian. It's why I used hand-carving techniques." A particularly violent tremor shook the shelter. A small section of the ceiling came loose, but it fell harmlessly into one of the collection channels Noah had created for exactly this purpose. "How did you know to do that?" Sarah asked, pointing at the channel that had safely directed the debris away from them. "My great-grandfather was trapped in an ice cave during an Antarctic storm," Noah explained, making small adjustments to the ventilation baffles as the wind direction shifted outside. "He developed these techniques to prevent being crushed when the ice shifted. I adapted them for obsidian." For the next 2 hours, the 3 cadets huddled in Noah's shelter as the superstorm raged outside. Twice more they admitted fellow students whose technological shelters had failed. First Verax, whose plasma cutter had exploded spectacularly, and then a minivan named Zell, whose molecular bond shelter had simply dissolved when exposed to an unexpected chemical component in the plasma storm. By the time the storm began to subside, Noah's small shelter contained 5 cadets from across the galaxy, all of whom had arrived with cutting-edge technology, and all of whom had been saved by his primitive knife and traditional knowledge. When the seismic activity finally fell below dangerous levels and the plasma winds died down to mere gusts, Professor Grethen's voice came through their communication devices. "All cadets report status." One by one, survivors checked in. Of the 38 who had begun the exercise, 32 had survived, many in the emergency bunkers, having abandoned their shelters. Only 7 shelters had remained habitable throughout the storm. Noah's was the only one on their section of the cliff that had remained not just intact but fully functional, with its ventilation and temperature regulation systems still working as designed. "Remain in place," Professor Grethen instructed. "Rescue teams are en route to your locations." The 5 cadets in Noah's shelter looked at each other in the dim light. There was a new respect in their eyes as they regarded the human with his simple knife. "I called it a letter opener," Thornick said suddenly, his voice contrite. "I apologize. Noah Briggs of Earth." Noah shrugged. "It's been called worse." "How did you know?" Sarah asked. "How did you know your shelter would hold when our advanced technology failed?" Noah ran his thumb along the worn wooden handle of his knife. Technology is a tool, not a solution. This knife didn't build the shelter. Understanding did. My great-grandfather used to say that survival isn't about having the best equipment. It's about having the best relationship with your environment. Varex's blue skin flushed a deeper shade, the Andromedan equivalent of thoughtful embarrassment. We were fighting against the obsidian. You were working with it. Exactly, Noah confirmed. The rock already knew how it wanted to break, where it wanted to channel stress, how it would respond to heat. I just had to listen and follow its lead. When the rescue teams arrived, led by Professor Grethen herself, they found the 5 cadets not huddled in desperate survival, but engaged in an impromptu class, with Noah demonstrating basic carving techniques using a small piece of obsidian. The professor's crystalline features arranged themselves into an expression Noah couldn't quite interpret as she surveyed his shelter, now revealed in full daylight to be not just functional, but elegant in its organic, responsive design. "Cadet Briggs," she said finally, "it appears I owe you an apology." Noah stood at attention. "No apology needed, Professor." "Nevertheless," she insisted, her crystalline voice taking on a new tone of respect, "you have demonstrated the principle that the Academy was founded upon, but that too many of us have forgotten in this age of advanced technology. True exploration and survival require not just tools but understanding." She gestured at the ruins of the technologically carved shelters that lay scattered along the cliff face. These failed not because the tools were inferior, but because the wielders lacked the fundamental understanding of geological principles that you demonstrated. The following day, after all cadets had been accounted for and the injured treated, Professor Grethen gathered the surviving students for a debrief. To Noah's surprise, his shelter had not been dismantled, but instead had been scanned and recorded in detail. "The design principles demonstrated by Cadet Briggs will be incorporated into the Academy's non-technological survival curriculum," she announced. "His shelter withstood conditions that exceeded our worst-case scenarios by 47%. She turned to Noah. "Would you explain your ventilation system to your fellow cadets, particularly the pressure equalization channels that prevented explosive decompression during the storm's peak?" For the next hour, Noah found himself teaching techniques that his great-grandfather had developed on Earth centuries earlier, adapted through his own understanding to work with alien materials on a volcanic planet, light years from home. As the survival training on Volcarus continued over the subsequent days, Noah noticed a significant shift in attitude among his fellow cadets. Many now carried traditional tools alongside their technological ones. Several had asked him to teach them basic hand-carving techniques. Even Professor Grethen had requested a demonstration of his knife's capabilities in different geological materials. On the final day, as they prepared to depart Volcarus, the professor presented Noah with the highest marks possible for the survival course. The first perfect score awarded in 17 years. "Your knife, Cadet Briggs," she said as the transport vessel prepared for departure. "Would you consider allowing it to be displayed in the Academy's Historical Technologies collection? With full attribution, of course, and the option for you to reclaim it upon graduation." Noah hesitated, his hand moving instinctively to the sheath at his belt. Professor Grethen noticed his reluctance. "Perhaps that was presumptuous of me. It is clearly more than just a tool to you." "It's a connection," Noah explained, "to my great-grandfather, to Earth, to a way of understanding the universe that doesn't separate technology from knowledge." The crystalline professor nodded. "A wise perspective. Perhaps instead, you would assist in creating a holographic exhibit. We could display the knife temporarily, record its specifications and history, and then return it to you." Noah agreed to this compromise. A week later, in the Academy's prestigious Historical Technologies collection, a new exhibit appeared. It featured a holographic representation of Noah's knife alongside recordings of the shelter it had helped create on Volcarus. Beneath it was inscribed a quote that Noah had attributed to his great-grandfather. "Survival is not the dominance of machines. It is the endurance of understanding." The exhibit became unexpectedly popular among both students and faculty. Many were surprised to learn that the simple tool had outperformed cutting-edge technology in one of the most extreme environments in the galaxy. Some skeptics dismissed it as a fluke. Others recognized the deeper lesson it represented. For Noah, the experience on Vulcarus had confirmed what he had always believed: that technology divorced from fundamental understanding was inherently fragile. His great-grandfather's knife had never been merely a piece of metal. It was a physical embodiment of accumulated wisdom, a reminder that survival depended not on having the most advanced tools, but on having the deepest connection to one's environment. As his education at the academy continued, Noah maintained this philosophy. He embraced new technologies when they were appropriate, but never abandoned the core principles that had kept him alive on that obsidian cliff face. He continued to carry his great-grandfather's knife, now marked with the additional history of having saved lives on a distant, volcanic world. And sometimes, when newer cadets would look at it skeptically or make jokes about ancient Earth relics, Noah would simply smile, remembering the respect it had earned during that plasma superstorm on Vulcarus. The knife didn't need to prove itself again. Like true wisdom, it remained sharp and ready, regardless of whether its value was recognized at first glance. Years later, when Noah became an instructor at the academy himself, he would begin each term by showing his students not the latest exploration technology, but his great-grandfather's knife. He would tell them the story of Vulcarus, of obsidian shelters and plasma storms, of technological failure and traditional knowledge. "Before I teach you to use the tools of exploration," he would say, "I must first teach you to understand the environments you seek to explore. For without that understanding, even the most advanced technology is nothing more than an expensive way to fail." And in the Academy's curriculum, alongside courses on plasma propulsion and xenobiology, there remained a required class called Non-Technological Survival Strategies, where students learned to listen to the rocks, to work with natural forces rather than against them, and to value understanding above equipment. The course's emblem, displayed on every syllabus, was a simple earth-made knife with a wooden handle, a reminder that sometimes the oldest technologies carry the newest wisdom. As for Professor Grethen, she continued to begin each term's survival training with an equipment inspection. But now, when she encountered cadets with traditional tools alongside their technological ones, she would nod approvingly rather than laugh. And occasionally, when she spotted a particularly well-crafted hand tool, she would ask its owner, "But do you understand it as well as Cadet Briggs understood his knife?" It became the highest standard to which Academy students could aspire, not merely to possess knowledge or technology, but to understand it deeply enough that it became an extension of themselves, a conversation with the universe rather than an imposition upon it. And somewhere, Noah liked to think, his great-grandfather was smiling,